The candle on the nightstand had burned down to almost nothing. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in a room she did not know, in a house that did not feel like hers, wearing a dress she had borrowed from a woman she barely called a friend. The room smelled of cedar and old leather and something else, something she couldn't name. Something closed off. Like a space that had been sealed for a long time and only recently opened again, not because anyone wanted it open but because it had to be. She could hear the wind outside pushing against the windows. Out here on the plains the wind never really stopped. It just changed its mind about how hard it wanted to blow. Her husband, and it still felt strange to think that word husband, was downstairs. She had heard his boots on the floorboards for a while, pacing back and forth near the front of the house. Then silence. Then the soft sound of a chair being pulled out. Then nothing at all. She was trying to decide whether to go down to him or wait for him to come up when she heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Slow. Deliberate. Like whoever was on the other side of that door had thought very carefully about each one before they knocked. Clara froze. It was past midnight. The ranch was miles from the nearest town. There was no reason for anyone to be standing at that door at this hour. None that she could think of. She heard her husband's chair scrape against the floor below. She heard him stand. And then she heard something that stopped her breath entirely. She heard him whisper something to himself, not loud enough to make out the words, and whatever he said, it was not the sound of a man surprised by an unexpected guest. It was the sound of a man who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Clara Voss had not planned to marry anyone that year. She had not planned much of anything that year, because the year had not given her the space to plan. It had come at her fast and hard, the way bad years tend to do, not all at once but in layers, each one pressing down a little heavier than the last until she could feel the weight of it in her chest every morning when she opened her eyes. It started with her father's hand. He had been working the field alone one afternoon in early spring. Clara had been in town buying flour and salt, and something in the plow mechanism had caught wrong. The details were never fully clear to her, and her father was not a man who liked to talk about pain or weakness, so she had pieced it together mostly from what the doctor told her and what she could see with her own eyes. 2 fingers on his right hand, gone just past the second knuckle. The kind of wound that heals, eventually, but does not return a man to what he was. Her father was a farmer. Had been one his whole life. His hands were not incidental to who he was. They were the whole story. After that, the farm began its slow retreat. The spring planting was late. The summer was dry. The well they shared with the neighboring property ran low in August and the corn came in thin. Her younger brother Eli did what he could, but Eli was 15 and built slight, and the land they worked was not kind to good intentions alone. By October, they were behind on the payment they owed to the bank in Harlan. Not by a little. By enough that the man from the bank, a thin, pale-eyed man named Desmond who wore his collar too tight and seemed to enjoy delivering bad news, had come out to the property twice already that season. Clara's mother had gotten sick in September. Not dramatically, not the way sickness announces itself in stories. Just a quiet retreat. A cough that didn't leave. A tiredness that started in her eyes and worked its way down until she spent most of her afternoons in the back room with the curtains drawn, sleeping or something close to it. So that was the picture. A damaged father. A sick mother. A young brother trying to carry too much. A farm bleeding money. A banker circling. And then someone told Clara about Edmund Hale. She had heard the name before, the way you hear the names of wealthy men in small towns, in passing, in whispers, attached to numbers that don't feel quite real. Edmund Hale owned the largest cattle operation in the county. People said he had over 2,000 head. People said the land his ranch sat on stretched so far you couldn't ride the edges of it in a single day. People said a lot of things about Edmund Hale, and most of those things had to do with money, and all of them had to do with distance. The way he kept himself apart from town life, from social events, from the kind of casual neighborliness that most people took for granted. He was not exactly a recluse. He came to town when he needed to. He conducted his business clearly and fairly by most accounts. He paid his workers on time. He did not start trouble. But he also did not seem to want company, and people had learned over the years to respect that. He was 41 years old. Clara was 26. He had been married before. His wife had died, some years ago now, and no one in town seemed entirely sure of the details. When Clara asked the woman who first mentioned his name, a seamstress named Patrice who knew everything about everybody, Patrice had looked slightly uncomfortable and said only that it had been a difficult situation, and that Edmund had never really recovered from it. That should have been enough to end the conversation. It wasn't. Because Patrice, in the same breath, had also mentioned that Edmund Hale had let it be known, quietly through a lawyer, the way men with money tend to let things be known, that he was looking to marry again. Not for love, or at least not primarily for love. He was getting older. He wanted the ranch carried forward. He wanted a household that functioned. He wanted, in the plain-spoken way Patrice put it, a capable woman who could manage things and wasn't afraid of hard work in wide-open space. Clara had gone home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time after everyone else was asleep. She looked at the column of numbers she had been working on. The amount owed to the bank. The amount they had. The gap between those two numbers, which was not closing on its own and would not close on its own. She thought about her mother's cough. She thought about her father's hand, about the way he held it sometimes without realizing it, curled against his side like he was still protecting something that wasn't there anymore. She thought about Eli, 15 years old and already walking with the posture of someone carrying a grown man's worries. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. 3 days later, she sent a letter to Edmund Hale's lawyer in Harlan. They met for the first time at the lawyer's office. A formal meeting, almost businesslike, which was strange and also somehow a relief. Clara had been afraid of what it might feel like to sit across from a man and negotiate the terms of a life together, but Edmund Hale had made it easier than she expected by treating the whole thing with a quiet, practical seriousness that she found she could match. He was not what she had pictured. She had expected someone more forceful, more commanding, a man whose wealth announced itself in his bearing. Edmund Hale was tall but not imposing, lean from years of outdoor work. His hair was dark with threads of gray running through it, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was hard to read. Not cold exactly. Just contained. He asked her 3 questions. Could she run a household? Yes. Was she in good health? Yes. Did she understand what she was agreeing to, that this was a practical arrangement, that he would treat her fairly and provide for her family's debts to be cleared, but that he was not a man who made promises of things he couldn't guarantee? She had looked at him for a long moment before answering that one. Yes, she said. She understood. He had nodded. Just once. And that was more or less the entirety of their courtship. The wedding was small. The preacher from the Methodist church in Harlan, a few witnesses, her father and mother and Eli standing in a line that looked both proud and uncomfortable. Edmund Hale stood at the front of the small room with his hands clasped and his expression unreadable, and when Clara came to stand beside him, he looked at her with something in his eyes that she could not identify. Not love. She hadn't expected love. But not nothing either. Something careful. Something that had been locked behind a door for a long time and was not quite sure it was ready to open. She thought about that look all the way to the ranch, sitting beside him in the wagon, the plains rolling out around them in every direction, the sky enormous and going pink at the edges from the setting sun. She had made a choice. She had made it with open eyes. She told herself that was enough. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The ranch was bigger than she had imagined and stranger. Not strange in the way that things are strange when you simply don't know them yet. Strange in the way that a room feels strange when something has been removed from it and no one has told you what. You can sense the shape of the absence without being able to name it. The house itself was large and well built, with good furniture and enough rooms that Clara could walk down a hallway and feel genuinely uncertain where it led. The ranch hands were polite but quiet around her. Too quiet, she would think later. The kind of quiet that is careful rather than natural. There was one room at the end of the upper hallway that was locked. She noticed it on her second day there when she was learning the layout of the house. She tried the handle without thinking much about it. She was simply orienting herself, opening doors to understand the space, and found it didn't give. She made a note of it and moved on. That evening she asked Edmund about it over dinner. She kept her voice light, curious but not pressing. He didn't look up from his plate right away. Just a half-second of stillness before he reached for his water glass. Then he said it was a storage room. Old things. Nothing she needed to concern herself with. She nodded and let the subject change. But she thought about it that night. The days that followed had a surface rhythm to them that almost felt ordinary. Clara learned the house. She spoke with the cook, a Tejano woman named Rosaria who had worked for Edmund for years and who greeted Clara with warmth that felt genuine but also slightly guarded, like she was deciding something about her that hadn't been decided yet. Clara learned where things were kept. She began to understand the schedule of the ranch, the comings and goings, the hours Edmund was out with his men and the hours he returned. He was not unkind to her. He was present at meals. He answered her questions. He asked her occasionally how she was settling in, and the asking seemed sincere. But there was always something withheld. Always a door, not just the literal one at the end of the hall, but something in the way he carried himself, something in the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and seem to think better of what he had been about to say. she noticed other things. The ranch hands did not talk about the time before she arrived. Not naturally, the way workers at any place will naturally reference the past. If she asked something, "What was it like last winter? Has the south pasture always flooded this time of year?" the answers came short and careful, and then the subject was redirected. She began to feel, without quite being able to say why, that there was a version of this ranch's history that she was not being given access to. Once, coming back from the barn in the early evening, she saw two of the older ranch hands, men who had worked for Edmund for years, she gathered, standing near the fence talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw her. Both of them. At exactly the same moment, as if they had rehearsed it. One of them touched his hat and said good evening, and the other just nodded, and both of them found somewhere else to be very quickly. Clara stood there in the fading light and listened to the wind move through the grass. Something happened here, she thought. Something that everyone knows about except me. It was Rosaria who gave her the first real piece of it. Not intentionally. Or maybe intentionally, Clara was never fully sure. But it happened in the kitchen, about 2 weeks after Clara arrived, on a morning when the two of them were working side by side and had settled into a comfortable enough rhythm that the silence between them had become the comfortable kind. Rosaria was talking about nothing in particular, the weather, a delivery that was late from town, when she mentioned, almost in passing, that it had been a hard few years since the trouble with Margaret. She said it the way you say something you've said 100 times to people who already know the story. Then she seemed to hear herself and she stopped. Clara kept her eyes on what she was doing. She didn't look up. She kept her voice casual. What was the trouble? The pause that followed was long enough to have a shape. "I shouldn't have said that," Rosaria said finally. Her voice had changed. Quieter. More careful. "It's not my place." "Rosaria." "No, Mrs. Hale." And that was the first time anyone had called her that, and the sound of it landed strangely. "I'm sorry. I misspoke." She didn't say another word about it for the rest of the morning. But Clara had a name now. Margaret. Edmund's first wife. She had known in the abstract that there had been a first wife. Patrice the seamstress had mentioned it. The lawyer had acknowledged it when she asked. But no one had given her a name and no one had given her details, and it had existed in the back of her mind as a fact without substance, something she knew but couldn't see. Now she had a name. And she had the word Rosaria had used, trouble. Not loss. Not sorrow. Not the way you would say it about a woman who had died young from illness or accident, the way you might lower your voice slightly and say it was a shame, it was a tragedy, she was so young. Trouble was a different word. Trouble had edges to it. That night, Clara lay awake for a long time. Edmund was asleep beside her, or seemed to be. His breathing had the steadiness of sleep, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the locked room at the end of the hall and the name Margaret and the careful silence of everyone on this ranch and what it all added up to. She didn't know yet. She couldn't get there from what she had. But she was getting closer. She found the photograph 3 days later. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been going through a cabinet in the study. Edmund had asked her to find a specific ledger from 2 years ago, and beneath a stack of papers at the back of a bottom drawer, her fingers found the edge of something stiffer than paper. It was a photograph, the old kind, slightly formal in the way photographs used to be. A woman. Young or youngish, hard to say exactly with the faded quality of the image. Dark-haired. Slender. Standing in front of what appeared to be the porch of this very house, which had looked slightly different then, fewer boards, one of the posts not yet replaced. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't Edmund's, 2 words. Always. Clara stood in the study for a long time holding that photograph. Looking at the woman in it. Trying to read something in a face that didn't move, in a moment that was already years in the past. She put it back exactly where she had found it. She found the ledger. She brought it to Edmund and didn't say anything. But that night she dreamed of a woman standing on the porch in the dark, and in the dream the woman turned to look at her, and her face was afraid. The wedding night. They had delayed the formality of it, by unspoken agreement, during those first days of settling and adjustment. Neither of them had pressed the other. It had simply waited, the way things wait when no one addresses them directly. 2 weeks and 3 days after the wedding it stopped waiting. Clara doesn't think about the particulars of that night very often even now. What she thinks about, when she thinks about it, is the quality of it. The strange combination of tenderness and distance that seemed to coexist in Edmund Hale. The way he was present but also, somehow, somewhere else, like a man standing on the near side of a river watching the far bank. She had thought about Margaret. She had wondered if he was thinking about her too. Afterward he had gone downstairs. She had heard him moving around below, the particular restlessness of a man who can't settle. She had sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the wind and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what she had done and what she was now and what she didn't know. The candle burned down. And then 3 knocks came at the door. Clara did not go downstairs immediately. Something held her, not fear exactly but caution. An instinct that said, wait. Listen first. She heard Edmund cross to the door. She heard the door open. And then she heard a voice, a man's voice, low and rough-edged, the voice of someone who had been riding for a while in the cold, and what it said made the hair on her arms stand up. I found her, Edmund. I found where she is. A long silence. Then Edmund's voice, quieter than she had ever heard it, drained of everything but something that might have been fear or might have been relief or might have been both at once. Come inside. Clara came down the stairs slowly. She had put her dress back on. Her feet were bare on the cold wood. The man at the door was someone she didn't recognize, weathered, 50s, wearing the kind of coat that had been worn hard for a long time. He had a deputy's badge on his chest that caught the lamplight. He looked up when she appeared on the stairs and his face shifted into something uncomfortable. Edmund turned to look at her. His face in the lamplight was undone. That was the only word for it. The careful, contained man she had been watching for 2 weeks and trying to understand was gone, and what was underneath was raw and exhausted and somehow younger, a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. Clara, he said. And she looked at him and said quietly, tell me. He told her. Not everything at once. It came out in pieces, the way truth tends to come out when it has been held back long enough. Not in a clean line but in fragments, each one requiring the next one to make sense. Margaret was alive. That was the first piece. And it changed everything that followed. She had not died. She had left. 4 years ago, in the middle of the night, without a word, without a note that said anything useful. Edmund had woken up one morning and she was gone. The horse was gone. A small amount of money from the household box was gone. He had looked for her. That was the second piece. Not publicly, not in a way that would invite the town's curiosity and judgment, but quietly, persistently for 4 years. The man at the door was a tracker he had hired over a year ago, a man who had finally now found something. Where? Clara asked. Arizona Territory, the man said. Small town. She's been living under a different name. He glanced at Edmund, some private signal passing between them. She's not alone. Clara sat down in the chair by the window. She needed to sit. You're still married to her, she said. Edmund didn't answer right away. The silence was its own answer. The lawyer said she was dead, Clara said. Her voice was very steady, which surprised her. When I met with the lawyer before we married, he said your wife had passed. I told him to say that. Edmund's voice was barely audible. I told him to handle it that way because I didn't know how else to, because I didn't know if she would ever be found and I couldn't. He stopped. Started again. I thought I was doing it the right way. I thought enough time had passed. You thought wrong, Clara said. And the room went quiet. She learned the rest of it over the next hour. The man, the tracker, whose name was Briggs, sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Rosaria had appeared to make without being asked, because Rosaria had clearly known this night was coming and had prepared herself for it in the only way she knew how. Margaret Hale had not left because she was unhappy. Or not only because of that. She had left because of something that happened in the 3rd year of their marriage. Something that Edmund had buried so deep under his need for order and control that he had, Clara believed, almost convinced himself it hadn't happened at all. He had gambled away a significant portion of the ranch's assets. Not the land itself, but cattle, equipment, savings. A bad run of judgment over a period of months, the kind of slow disaster that happens when a proud man makes one mistake and then makes worse ones trying to cover the first. He had told Margaret it would be recovered. He had told her not to worry. He had, in the language of a man who equates controlling information with protecting people, kept it from her as long as he could and then minimized it when he couldn't. When she found out the full truth, not from him but from overhearing a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, she had felt not just the financial fear of it but the betrayal of it. The years of being managed instead of trusted. She had taken what she took and left in the night. And Edmund, in his pride and his shame and his grief, had told no one what had really happened. Not the truth of it. He had let the story settle into something vague. A death, an illness, a difficult situation. And he had spent the next 4 years rebuilding what he had lost financially and closing himself off from everything else. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When Briggs finished, she looked at Edmund. Does she want to come back? She asked. Briggs shifted in his seat. She doesn't know I found her yet. I came here first. But does she have a life there? Is she? She has a child, Briggs said. And the way he said it was careful, the way you say something that changes the shape of a room. About 2.5 years old. Edmund's jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere else for a moment. Not mine, he said quietly. The timing it isn't mine. Clara stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark of the plains, at the distant shapes of the hills she was just beginning to learn, and she thought about her mother's cough and her father's hand and Eli and the farm and the money that was now paid and the life she had stepped into with open eyes. Open eyes. She almost laughed at herself for thinking that. She turned around. What do you want? She asked Edmund. Not accusingly. Genuinely. He looked at her for a long time. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It simply let her see it. No containment. No careful management. I don't know, he said. I've been asking myself that question for 4 years and I still don't know. That's honest, she said. It's all I have right now. She nodded slowly. Then we need to figure it out, she said. Together. Because whatever it is, it involves me now. Briggs left before dawn, with instructions to go back to Arizona but to do nothing further until he heard from Edmund directly. He rode out into the dark in the wind, and Clara stood on the porch and watched the shape of him disappear into the distance. And then she stood there alone for a while after he was gone, listening to the horses shifting in the barn, the first birds beginning somewhere out in the grass. She thought about what she was. She thought about the word that applied to her current situation. A word she had no desire to say out loud because saying it out loud would make it fully real. She was not a wife. Not legally. Not truly. She was a woman who had made a bargain in good faith with a man who had not been in a position to make that bargain. The fact that he had not done it maliciously, that he had told himself a story about time and practicality and necessity until he almost believed it, did not change what it was. And yet, she thought about her family. The debt was paid. Truly paid. Edmund had settled it within days of the marriage, and the banker with the tight collar would not be coming back. Her mother was already talking about seeing the doctor in Harlan. Her father had been given a sum of money that would carry the farm for at least 2 more years. Eli was talking about a school in the county seat. Those things were done. They couldn't be undone. She went back inside. Edmund was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked up when she came in. In the gray light before sunrise he looked older than he had the night before, and more honest, and she found to her own surprise that she could sit down across from him without anger, that what she felt was not the hot edge of fury but something steadier, sadder, more complex. I need you to understand something, she said. I'm not angry because of Margaret. I'm angry because you made a choice for me. You decided what I needed to know and what I didn't, and you decided I needed to know less. And that's not something I can agree to going forward. Whatever happens, whether she comes back, whether this gets untangled legally, whatever the next months look like, that part changes. You tell me things. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You sound like her. That's exactly what she told me. Before she left. Then maybe, Clara said, you should have listened the first time. He didn't argue. He just looked at the table for a long moment and then looked back up at her, and there was something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. I should have, he said. I know that now. The months that followed were not easy and not simple, but then Clara had never expected easy or simple. Margaret was contacted. Briggs made the trip to Arizona with a letter, 2 letters actually. One from Edmund, which Clara did not read and did not ask to read, because some things are between people and their history and don't need a third witness. And one from Clara, which she wrote herself carefully, over the course of 2 evenings. She did not know exactly what to say to a woman she had never met, whose life had intersected with her own in the strangest possible way. She had started several versions and abandoned them. In the end she wrote something short. She said she understood that Margaret had left for reasons that were real. She said she did not intend to be anyone's obstacle. She said she wanted to know the truth and was willing to figure out what came next without pretending the situation was simpler than it was. She signed it Clara Voss. Not Clara Hale. Not yet, not ever, maybe. Margaret wrote back. Her handwriting was nothing like what Clara had imagined, not the delicate, careful hand she had half expected from the woman in the photograph, but direct and plain and strong. She wrote that she had no intention of returning, that she had made a life, a real one, and that her son was healthy and that she was, for the first time in a long time, at peace. She wrote that she did not hate Edmund, but that she also could not be what he had needed her to be, and that was the end of it. She agreed to what was necessary for the legal process. A dissolution. It took time, These things always took time out here, paperwork moving slowly between counties and territories, but it moved forward. Edmund changed. Or maybe he had always been capable of this version of himself and the years of shame had buried it. Clara watched him become, slowly, less sealed. He ate meals and talked during them. He began to tell her things without her having to ask. Small things at first, then larger ones. He told her about the gambling, the full story without her pressing him. He told her what it had felt like to lose Margaret, the specific grief of it, the way it had mixed with guilt until he could barely separate them. She listened. She didn't offer easy comfort. That wasn't her way and it wasn't what he needed. The locked room at the end of the hall was opened one afternoon in spring. He did it while she was there, not dramatically, just unlocked it and pushed the door open and stood aside. It was not sinister inside. It was simply Margaret's things. Furniture she had chosen, curtains she had hung, small personal objects she had left in her departure's haste or simply not wanted to take. He had sealed the room because he hadn't been able to deal with it, which was, Clara understood now, the way Edmund Hale had handled most things that hurt. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Change it," he said. "Start over. With your help if you want." She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the ghost of another woman's choices, at the space that had been kept in suspension for years, and she thought about what it meant to start over in a place that already had a history. Whether that was possible. Whether you could truly make something new out of something that had already been something else. She thought you could. She thought it was hard and slow and required honesty at every step, but she thought you could. "All right," she said. "But I want that curtain down first. It's the wrong color for this light." He laughed. It surprised both of them, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard from him before. It was a good sound. She filed it away. She is not going to tell you that everything was resolved into happiness and warmth and ease. That would be a lie, and this story has had enough of those. What she will tell you is this. By the following year, the dissolution was complete and a proper marriage was performed. Small, again, just the preacher and a few witnesses and her family, her father standing straighter this time, her mother's cough mostly gone from the doctor's treatment, Eli taller by an inch and already talking about what he wanted to study. By the following year, Rosaria had stopped being guarded and started being a friend, which was a thing Clara had not expected and was quietly grateful for. By the following year, the locked room had been turned into something light and functional, with curtains Clara had chosen and a window she kept open in the morning so the air could move through. By the following year, Margaret was living her own life in Arizona, her son learning to walk and then to run, and she had written one more letter to Clara, just one, brief but genuine. It said, "I hope it becomes what you needed it to be." Clara had read it twice and then set it down on the table in the good light of the late afternoon and sat with it for a while. What do you need a marriage to be? What do you need a life to be? She had gone into this arrangement thinking she knew the answers. She had needed safety, provision, rescue, the immediate and practical salvation of people she loved. She had gotten that. She had gotten it in a way that was flawed and complicated and layered in deceit she hadn't known about, and she had had to decide, on a cold morning with bare feet and a candle burned to nothing, what to do with that. She had decided to stay. Not out of resignation. Not because she had no options. She had stayed because she had looked at this broken, sealed-up, too-proud man across a kitchen table in the gray light before dawn and seen something in him that she thought was worth the trouble. Something that could, given time and honesty, become something she had not anticipated when she signed her name on that lawyer's paper. Not a rescue. Something better than that. A partnership. There is a view from the porch of that ranch house that Clara thinks about when she thinks about that year and everything that came after it. The way the planes roll out in every direction until they meet the sky, and the sky is enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the wind comes through the grass in long slow waves that you can see moving before you feel them. She had been afraid of that view when she first arrived. It had felt like exposure, like standing in a place where there was nowhere to hide. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. She stood on that porch most mornings now, early before the ranch was fully awake, and she let the wind come. She let the bigness of the land be what it was. She let herself be a small thing in the middle of it, which is all any of us are, out here or anywhere else. She thought about choices. About how rarely they are clean and simple. About how the best ones, the ones that end up meaning something, are usually the ones made without a full picture, with only what you know and what you need and what you are willing to risk. She had risked. Not everything had been what she thought it was. She was still here. And some mornings, Edmund would come out and stand beside her without saying anything, and they would watch the light change over the plains together, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind now, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because it is already full. That was enough. Some mornings that was everything.